Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the Carnegie Endowment's program on American Statecraft, and we're here for the next installment of Pivotal States, in which we examine America's interests and strategic options in its most important bilateral relationships around the world. Today, we're talking about Poland, which has a major election coming up this weekend. Poland has emerged as one of the most important nations in Europe. It's the largest country to have joined the European Union since the end of the Cold War, both in economic weight and in population. It's a leader on defense issues at a time when many US allies have struggled to meet NATO's goal of spending 2% of GDP on defense. Poland has passed a law requiring it to spend 3%, and it may go even higher than that. It's also an economic success story in Central Europe with steady growth and a healthy private sector. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, it has provided a critical logistical hub for supplies into Ukraine and supported Ukraine in a variety of other ways. Polish politics, however, are highly polarized. The Law and Justice Party, or PiS, as it is known by its Polish acronym, that has ruled Poland since 2015, has been widely criticized for democratic backsliding. Poland's rankings in Freedom House and other indicators have slipped. PiS, meanwhile, has clashed on several fronts with the European Union, and relations with its larger neighbor, Germany, have become acrimonious. Polish citizens will go to the polls on Sunday in their first election in 4 years, and the outcome could have big implications for the direction of Poland's foreign policy. What are the stakes for America in the outcome of these elections? How should Washington approach this partner, which is so strong in some areas and so potentially problematic in others? How does Poland fit into the broader geopolitical context that Washington faces now in the mid-21st century? So with me today to tackle these questions are two top foreign policy experts. Ambassador Paula Dobriansky is Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's also a former U.S. Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. Professor Charlie Kupchan is Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University and served as President Obama's top advisor on Europe from 2014 to 2017. Thanks to you both for being here.
Good to be with you, Chris.
Ambassador Dobriansky, let me start with you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
I'd like to start by asking you what you think America's main interests are when it comes to Poland. What should the White House really prioritize in this relationship?
Well, first, thank you again, Chris, and congratulations to Carnegie for specifically having this series on statecraft and featuring Poland. I'd first start with the fact that, number one, the geostrategic partnership with Poland is key. It's been long-standing with regard to our bilateral relationship and also the Transatlantic partnership. The fact is, sometimes the joke is made, there are more Poles in the United States than there are in Poland. We have a strong diaspora, so we're tied, not just only in political, economic, military ways, but even just by our own populations. So in that sense, it matters. But let me go to, the first is, we have a long-standing geopolitical or geostrategic relationship with Poland, and we've been bound by shared and mutual interests and support for the Transatlantic partnership. Right now, the key issue that's front and center is obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Poles are very concerned about what this means for their own security and for that of Europe as a whole. And for the transatlantic community, no less the global community. And in that sense, the White House, all policymakers are concerned about Poland's investment in this situation militarily, their support for sanctions economically, and also that we have the same kind of mission. If I may just take a few more minutes just to mention a few other aspects, because this is obviously one of the most crucial issues, but actually, you know, the relationship and our investment in Poland goes also well beyond that. I'd also start with, on the economic front, energy is a key issue and climate change for the Biden administration. And Poland launched the 3Cs initiative. It was Poland who also came up against Moscow and said, we're cutting off from Nord Stream 2. In this sense, the diversified energy supplies, the first shipment of LNG from the United States to Poland mattered, and our collaboration with them, not just on only a diversified energy supply, but also climate change. Militarily, Poland, the United States vested in Poland in 1999 when it became a member of NATO. And since that time, Poland, as you yourself mentioned, it's an active player, and not only an active player, but also what's crucial here is that Poland actually was has been very, very key in terms of its investments. Its investment is up beyond 2%, as you said, it's up to 4%. And not only that, but in this domain, Poland has been very key in terms of training, of assisting in this military, the military provisions to Ukraine at this very, very crucial time. Economic support, I said already, for sanctions, but not only that, as you know, although there have been some challenges, there's been the issue too over dealing with getting in supplies, the humanitarian support for the 1.5 million refugees that have come through Poland. And finally, let me just mention, I thought it was significant President Biden chose Poland to, after his visit to Ukraine, he gave and delivered his speech in Warsaw, highlighting the kind of partnership that we have in this fight against the invasion of Ukraine, but also thanking the people of Poland at large, for its support at a very, very crucial time. So here he underscored the strong, steady cooperation that we have. And I'll end on this note. It's also noteworthy, and forgive the long answer, but it's noteworthy. We've actually had 14, I actually looked back at this, 14 strategic dialogues with Poland. So that spans over different administrations, again, in terms of the tone and the tenor, the long-standing investment in Poland. Back to you, and I apologize for a bit unsteadiness in my connectivity here.
Ambassador, thank you very much. That gets us off to a great start.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned a number of different issues, including the 3Cs initiative, which is a sign of Poland's leadership in the region. Obviously, that's an effort to build connectivity across all of Central Europe, and something that's important to Poland in particular. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to talk about that later. But let me turn to you, Professor Kupchan, and ask you, how do you see it, sort of from the highest level? Both when you were in the White House and more recently, what do you think America's interests are when you look at Poland?
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly with Paula's overall assessment of the geopolitical interests at stake. And I think that going back to the Iraq War, when very few countries were with the United States, Poland stepped forward. Poland took on significant responsibilities. And now in the Ukraine war, I think you have to put Poland right at the front of the pack when it comes to countries that have been spending resources on defense. Poland's willingness to host Ukrainian refugees has been remarkable, especially when you look at the rather toxic debate within the EU about immigrants, particularly from the Middle East and Africa. But immigration is a very tough issue in Europe. Nonetheless, we've seen Poland, as well as other countries, be very generous. And I think that overall, in some ways, I see Poland as the new UK. That is to say, the country within the EU whose values when it comes to collective defense most line up with those of the United States. And that's important because the UK has left the EU. And as a consequence, the United States cannot count on its weight within Europe to help shape the Union in ways that are in line with American interests, and particularly against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the return to NATO's traditional mission of collective defense. I don't think the alignment of interests and perspectives between the Polish and the Americans should be understated. I don't think that, as some would say, we're witnessing the center of gravity shift to the east, that Poland is the new center of Europe. I think after this war in Ukraine dies down, and eventually it will, we'll see power shift to some extent back to the Franco-German coalition, although relations between Paris and Berlin are not in great shape. But let me end with just two reservations or words of caution that I think we need to keep front and center when we think about the relationship between the United States and Poland. One is Polish domestic politics. And to be rather blunt about it, I am much more concerned about the internal threat to the West than I am about the external threat to the West. You know, if we get our democratic houses in order, I'm confident that we will be able to deal with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and whoever else comes our way. If our political centers erode and we see a liberal populism continue to rise, we are in a heap of trouble. And I do think that we should be concerned about the direction of the Polish government, about its overreach domestically. And I get why we are giving Poland to some extent a free pass right now. And that's because the war in Ukraine is front and center. But I don't think that we should diminish our pressure, or that the EU should diminish its pressure on getting Poland back into the community of centrist liberal democracies. And I have to say, this keeps me up at night because the trend lines are not great. You know, here in this country, our political center is on life support. In Poland, in Hungary, in Italy, we have governments that have veered away from the traditions of liberal democratic institutions and practices. A recent election in Germany makes clear that their mainstream centrist parties, CDU and the Social Democrats, continue to lose market share, mainly to the far right. In France, yes, Macron is a centrist. No, I don't think that the political center in France is in good shape. So this is an issue that we have to keep front and center. Final point, even though I am very appreciative as an American of Poland's readiness to step up to the plate on defense, the role it's taken in Ukraine, really pushing the EU to move forward, and in some cases pushing us on issues of armaments, on tanks and other issues. I do think that we need a Poland that also invests in the future of Europe and European integration. We need a stronger Europe writ large. We need a Europe that aggregates its strength to become as good a partner of the United States as possible. And I don't think it's always helpful that Poland seems somewhat diffident about European integration. And the lead up to this election has been playing an anti-German card that I think is quite dangerous, because we need a strong, integrated Europe that is ready to step up to the plate geopolitically. And that requires good Franco-German, Polish relations. And as a consequence, I would encourage Poland, even as it invests strongly in its relationship with the US and NATO, to invest strongly in its relationships with its EU partners.
I think so. You've hit on also on a number of key points there. I mean, Poland being in many ways the ideal partner when it comes to burden sharing, the policies that we would like to see out of all of the rest of the alliance, but also, you know, problematic in its domestic politics, and also creating problems within the European Union that don't necessarily serve America's long-term interests. The question then is, from the perspective of U.S. statecraft, which of these do you prioritize? I mean, can you deal with all three of these at the same time? Ambassador Dobriansky, what do you think? I mean, how would you prioritize between these key issues?
Well, first, before I answer your question, if I may, I just have one comment I'd like to make on what Charlie had said regarding the challenge before us. I see it a little bit differently. I think we actually have been very complacent in terms of the rules-based order. We've been complacent, and now I'm not speaking, singling Poland. I'm talking about the whole transatlantic community, and of which the United States is part. I think that with the breakup of the Soviet Union and forward, I think that we were on a path, and we were on a path that, trying to make change and reforms, but at the same time, we took for granted what we were about in terms of our values, in terms of really speaking to these issues. And I feel that there was a kind of complacency, and that we really put aside a type of moral narrative. To me, that's one of the important elements. And I also think that we really ignored certain signals that pose threats at large, both external and internal. And I'll start with going back to the Munich Security Conference with Putin making his statement about we don't embrace Western values, and we can invade anywhere for those Russian speakers or ethnic Russians. And actually we went along, and in an ironic way, the current situation has galvanized our support, has underscored clearly what we are about. And I think all countries, and in my view, including Poland, have really stepped up to the plate because of it. Very important to take into account. So you asked me, Chris, what about balancing? Here, well, I think Charlie said it at the outset of his comments, and it certainly, it's the same on my end, and that is we are confronted at present with an unprovoked, stark, brutal invasion of Ukraine, which affects not just the security and the sovereignty of Ukraine, but also Poland is on the forefront of that battle. Europe is also concerned. And also it's striking to me that in another part of the world, well, even leaders like Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, delivered a speech here in Washington at Johns Hopkins University in which he said what happens in Ukraine and the fate of Ukraine will affect also us. So to answer your question, in dealing with the challenges of external and internal, I see that right now what is front and center and the priority is without a doubt the need to have unity of purpose. So there, with regard to Poland, accountability from them militarily, economically, politically in this fight against Moscow's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Its obvious desire for recapturing its sovereignty is the number one issue. And in that sense, that overtakes everything else. At the same time, I would say, and that's why I pointed out the strategic dialogue, here you have, President Biden speaking in Poland. At the same time, there was that 14th U.S.-Poland strategic dialogue. And by the way, all issues are on the table, including those kinds of challenges like the EU specifically challenging Poland's rule of law, the judiciary reforms, the media issues. All of these are part of our discourse. By the way, with close allies, with close friends, when we have differences, we do discuss them. We share with them what we think is right, what we think is wrong, And in this case, the dominant issue is without a doubt, the external threat. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a discourse where you have differences. And may I, Chris, if I may, mention there are a few other issues. Not only the EU, has taken action against Poland in previous years. There's this issue, the internal issue, but secondly, by the way, there are other issues. Charlie referenced Germany. An interesting tidbit here is when you look at, actually, in terms of Poland's exports, imports, Germany is number one. So actually, on the data provided, it's number one. But yes, there is this issue that's been put out there by Poland on reparations. And so I would say, I believe it's in Poland's interest, it's in Germany's interest, it's in the interest of the future of the transatlantic community to have issues resolved so that there is this kind of strong unity of purpose, not just only now, but going forward, that we don't have this kind of complacency. And let me mention a third, if I can. Another interesting one is when you look at Poland is very strong with us and with the West relative to Moscow. It's right there on the forefront of the battlefield. So in that sense, there's a very a strong kind of mission that we're joined by. Poland, when you look at the EU and its relationship with China, many countries within the EU have also not only been united in the EU, but they've also taken their own path. Poland has had an interesting path relative to China. It does also have a significant amount of trade with China. And a question here is, particularly in the area of technologies. During the Trump administration, there was an agreement signed not to go forward with 5G and Huawei. And so a question would be, how does this have bearing as one goes forward? So yes, Chris, there are different challenges in statecraft. There'll always be. I think you have to look at how close you are in the relationship, how you speak to your friends, your allies, your partners, and how you try to resolve challenges going forward, and what takes priority. And here, the invasion of Ukraine takes priority without a doubt. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having a discussion on issues where we have some differences, and then thinking about also how to also engage Poland, because it has so much to offer, and how it itself, it's in its own interest in resolving some of these issues for its own standing and contribution, not just to its own internal strength, but that of the transatlantic community and its relationship with us.
No, that's great. That's really very, very interesting. This is Pivotal States. I'm here with Professor Charlie Kupchan and Ambassador Paula Dobriansky talking about Poland, which has a big election coming up this weekend. Professor Kupchan, I want to turn back to you and see if I could push you a little bit. I mean, you laid out both the promise of our relationship with Poland, but also some of the challenges. Ambassador Dobriansky seems to be saying that, it's important that we prioritize Ukraine first, potentially also China in the broader geopolitical relationship with Poland. She's not saying, of course, that Poland's internal politics don't matter, but she pretty clearly said that the priority ought to be Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Paula got it right, and in the sense that right now we are still living through a strategic emergency, and that strategic emergency is the survival of Ukraine. And I believe that while that war continues and while we do our utmost to ensure Ukraine's success in that war, we do set aside some of the issues that concern us about domestic politics, about Poland's EU policies. But I don't think that means shelving them. I think it means keeping them part of the dialogue. And I would say here probably best done quietly and privately, especially in the context of a war. I don't think the President of the United States should be out there giving speeches about allies that air dirty laundry. I think right now the theme should be unity. But I also think we should keep in mind, number one, that we need to continue to focus on the domestic issues that the West confronts. There was a narrative early on in the Ukraine war. Well, the West is back, and now we face a new external threat, and we're going back to the good old days of bipartisanship. And guess what? We're not. As we're now seeing in the U.S. Congress, aid to Ukraine, bipartisanship is very hard to come by. And that says to me, let's not kid ourselves that external threats are going to solve our internal problems. We still have a lot of hard work to do. And I also think we need to have an honest conversation among ourselves about some of the trade-offs that we face here, especially now that we've got another war, the one in Israel, Gaza. We're gonna have other calls on our resources, and so the debate, at least here in the United States, is going to get more complicated. And the war in Ukraine is having certain blowback effects, whether it is in terms of high energy prices, inflation, refugees, that we need to factor into our policies moving forward. But I'm more or less where Paula is. That is to say, for now, we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with Poland and all of our allies in Europe when it comes to Ukraine. And I have to say, Chris, I'm extraordinarily impressed by the unity and the resolve that has been demonstrated. If we had had this conversation, let's say a year ago, and you had said, tell me where we're going to be in October of 2023, I would have said, well, things are going to have gone wobbly by now. Mm-hmm. But we're really just beginning to see the first wobbliness. The election in Slovakia, the budget debate here, Poland. As far as I understand, they said they were going to suspend arms. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paula, but I think they've kind of reversed that. This was the spat over imports of Ukrainian grain. So I think the level of transatlantic unity on the war in Ukraine has been very good. Final comment, I do think it's going to be more complicated moving forward. And that on both sides of the Atlantic, the domestic politics of giving Ukraine everything that it needs are going to get more difficult.
Ambassador Dobriansky, do you agree with that? First of all, were you surprised by the level of unity that we've seen over Ukraine at least within NATO and within the United States itself? And second of all, how do you think that looks as we move forward?
I have to give a lot of credit to the administration and also to all the countries and players in the European community. But it starts, since you're talking about statecraft, it's important to have active diplomacy and engagement. And I think that our Secretary of State, I'll start with him, I think he is very actively engaged in reaching out to all of the countries and trying to bring them together. I also think that here, when you think of statecraft, it's also important at the presidential level, the outreach to counterparts and to ensure that countries are sewn up. So, honestly, I wasn't surprised because I think that all the players involved here have been strong believers in statecraft, in diplomacy, and in very active diplomacy. And I think from that standpoint, as I said, they're to be commended. I'm not as, Charlie, you mentioned you're a little bit surprised it's lasted as long. I'm not so surprised, and I'll just say why. I mean, sure, there's going to be some fraying always at the seams, But I think the reason why I'm not surprised, I think countries are genuinely concerned about their security. I think actually, if you had asked me, Chris or Charlie, if I would have seen in my lifetime Finland and Sweden becoming part of NATO, no. There you go. But it's very striking. I think countries are genuinely worried. They're worried not only militarily, but even some of the questions of rebooting supply chains, which we hadn't witnessed before. As I mentioned, the rather striking energy shift, to me, is a real telltale sign of how countries want to deal with their own futures. So I think that what we've witnessed, that the invasion of Ukraine has actually been a kind of turning point in many ways for the transatlantic community and even for the global community at large. If I may just mention one last thing, because you asked the question before just about, sort of processes, I do think it's significant having these ongoing dialogues. The fact that in February of this year, it was the 14th U.S.-Polish strategic dialogue. Charlie mentioned that there are ways of addressing issues quietly. Well, that was the actual way of addressing issues where we do have some differences. And then also strengthening those areas that we want to strengthen. That kind of strategic dialogue, I think, is key for statecraft, and particularly for those countries that are important to us and we have mutual and shared interests.
This is Pivotal States with the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment. We're ready now to take any questions from our audience. We invite you to go ahead and submit them, and we will try to get to as many as we can. As we're waiting for those questions to be collected, Charlie, I wanted to pick up on something that Ambassador Dobriansky just said, which is that, this war has really made states in Europe, and perhaps especially those on the eastern flank, feel in a very concrete way the threat to their security that is posed by Russia under Vladimir Putin. In fact, the threat is potentially so large that sometimes doesn't it lead them to have strategic differences with the United States? Or do we always agree with Poland? Is the threat the same to America as it is to Poland?
No, I mean, I do think that some differences of opinion have opened up between the U.S. and let's call them the most forward-leaning members of the Central European coalition. So the Baltics and Poland, I would put there. One area where we saw some differences of opinion was on whether at the Vilnius summit to move ahead with an offer of membership to Ukraine for inclusion in NATO. I do think that the United States has moved with, in my mind, appropriate caution on the provision of certain sorts of weapon systems. And I think the Poles and the Balts have said, hey, let's not be so worried about escalation. Let's not be self-deterred. Let's get cracking. And I think what's going on there is partly proximity, that, you live next door to Russia, you face a threat that is palpable and imminent in a way that you don't if you're in Western Europe or here in the United States. And I also think a lot of it is history. Poles who lived before the collapse of the Soviet Union, or not just the Soviet Union, but the Warsaw Pact, they don't have particularly good memories of that era. And as a consequence, they bring to the table an urgency and a passion about this issue that I think puts them out in front of the U.S., Germany, France, when it comes to some of these issues. But as I think Paula and I both have stated, those differences are at the margins. And the big picture that we see beginning before the invasion, and I would join Paula in giving Tony Blinken and the president a lot of credit here. They did their homework. They were on the phones and in the airplanes tirelessly since late in the year before the invasion, putting together this coalition. It was ready to go on day one. And on all three lines of effort, aiding Ukraine, sanctioning Russia, bolstering NATO's eastern flank, I think that the storyline here is unity and resolve.
Do you think that unity will last beyond the war?
Well, I do think that some of the changes that we've seen since the war began are durable. I don't think that the United States will be anytime soon removing the forces that it has put in Europe since the war began. I think Finland and soon Sweden will be members of NATO, strengthening the alliance. And I don't really see any change to this picture while Vladimir Putin remains the leader of Russia. And that could be quite some time. You know, it may be that at some point we get an internal shift in politics in Russia. We get a Russia that wants to be part of Europe, not to roll back the post-Cold War order. But until that happens, I think we are seeing the kind of NATO alliance back in business as a collective defense organization. Will there be a new push for burden sharing once the war dies down? Yes. Will the United States again put more emphasis on the pivot to Asia and look to Europe to do more in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, maybe in Nagorno-Karabakh? Yes. But I do think that this resurgence in NATO and in the transatlantic unity is going to be with us for quite a while.
Again, this is Pivotal States with the American Statecraft program. We welcome your questions. Let me ask Ambassador Dobriansky, you had mentioned earlier on during our session here, Poland's support for U.S. objectives on China. We haven't talked much about China yet today because obviously Poland is primarily relevant to Russia and Ukraine in particular. But I wonder if you would lay out a little bit how you see Poland's support for American U.S.-China competition. How does Poland fit in? What can it do for the United States?
Well, it's an important issue, and it actually relates to, in a way, your last question, because you asked, what can we see of unity of purpose thereafter? So in the case of China, on one hand, if I could just give a backdrop, you have Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, making some very strong statements about the threat that China poses and has posed. And at the same time, even when you look at the EU and statements made across the board by different EU leaders, same thing. And by the way, there was just, I think it was a week ago, the EU-China summit, and in which there was a focus in which the Chinese, let me start with the EU, had announced that it wants to rebalance its trade relationship. But on the other hand, there was a real tough issue in the mix there, which the Chinese complained about, and that was this investigation of their subsidization of electronic vehicles, these EVs. And the EU is not backing down. And the Chinese said, well, nor are we. So with that backdrop, because Poland, of course, joining the EU 2004. So Poland, I would say, when you look at Poland in contrast to some of the other European countries, it has taken a little bit of a different path. The Baltic states, for example, have been very vocal against China, and they have been against this grouping of the 16+1. where they have opted not to be part of this Central European +1 discourse with China. In this case, let me then, just giving that backdrop, let me go to where is this issue at this time. I would say that first, Poland has opted to continue its trade relationship. There have been other countries in and throughout Europe that have, but then some of Poland's neighbors have, like Lithuania, been very specific against sustainment of the kind of relationship that it had heretofore, and has been very vocal in its support of Taiwan. So where does it fit in? I would say that Poland's position, as I could see it, on one hand is pursuing its own bilateral relationship. This does not go up against, I think, our overall position on China, but their position is one in which it is not front and center. Let me put it that way. For example, if you look at Poland's national security strategy, the issue of China is mentioned once. In our own national security strategy document, great power competition is featured in terms of Russia and China in multiple ways. So I think it could be said on one hand that we are on the same page. In the last administration, they agreed to sign on to, in the technology space, an agreement of not taking on 5G Huawei. However, there have been certain obstacles to that being completely dismantled. Legal obstacles, infrastructure obstacles. So in sum, where does it come out? It comes out that they're pursuing their own, which Poland has a right, of course, to pursue its path. But we have strived to indicate that we have concerns in the technological space, cyberspace, and also when it comes to threat. This has been an area that has been of great concern, looking at what China is doing militarily, economically, no less politically. I hope I've given a sense of, at least it's a Polish track. It's in the boundaries, I'd say, of unity of purpose, but there are a few challenges that
And I think that's to be expected.
And can be.
Absolutely. I think Poland is going to pursue its own interests. That would be a natural for any nation, especially a nation of Poland's growing size and importance. We have a couple of questions that I want to get to from our audience here. The first one takes us back to Ukraine. And Paul is wondering, how might Poland respond if the United States were to wind down its support for Ukraine, either in the near term or after the 2024 presidential elections in the United States? I mean, Charlie, do you have any thoughts about, I mean, this would obviously be a challenge for Poland and for many European allies. I mean, what do you think the Polish strategy would be if the United States were to wind down its military support to Ukraine?
Well, I think that there is a realistic prospect of that happening. Not a cutoff of the flow of U.S. aid, but aid flowing at lower levels, and that's simply because it looks like that's where we're headed in Congress. And my guess is that the president will continue to ask for 24 billion or more, and it may end up that Congress moves towards some kind of compromise, giving him something but not everything. And there are realistic constraints on stockpiles, whether it is ammunition for artillery, whether it is other kinds of munitions that the Ukrainians need. We are kind of running up against limits, even though we are turning up our production lines to produce more. So I think a cutoff of aid to Ukraine is very unlikely. A world in which the administration doesn't get everything that it wants is perhaps likely. And I think what will happen is that the U.S. will be in consultation with its allies to try to see who can fill in whatever gaps might be there. I do, though, think that, and this goes back to a comment I made a little while ago about the domestic politics of this getting more complicated. I think governments on both sides of the Atlantic, but in Europe as well, are a bit ahead of their publics when it comes to support for Ukraine. If you look at public opinion polls, they've gotten a bit soft, particularly in Italy, also a bit in Germany. And I do think that if the debate in this country heats up, and if you have the main Republican candidates for the presidency arguing against further aid, in some ways you'll see that voice spread across the Atlantic. And I'm concerned it may legitimate those voices on the other side. I think Poland, the Balts, will continue to provide aid at very, very high levels. It's interesting that as a consequence of the lack of consensus on NATO membership for Ukraine, countries are now developing bilateral programs where they're providing security assurances, quote unquote, and the U.S. may end up committing to give Ukraine a qualitative edge, is the terminology that Congress has used in the case of Israel. Where I don't want to venture a guess, but I'll put it out there, maybe Paula could comment on this. Could we imagine a scenario where a small group of countries led by Poland perhaps would be willing to put some boots on the ground, would be willing to put more skin in the game in Ukraine, perhaps to help, reinforce Ukrainian efforts? I'm going to remain agnostic about that.
That's a really interesting question. Obviously, it would raise all kinds of questions about whether or not NATO's Article 5 commitment covered those forces in Ukraine. But Ambassador Dobriansky, I'd be interested to hear what you think. Is that a possibility that might arise at some point?
Paula, I think your mute is on. Can you unmute?
Charlie, let me go to you while we try to bring Ambassador Dobriansky back.
My mute is off.
Okay.
Now it is. Okay.
Now we got you. Yeah, please. I mean,
I'm
do you
sorry,
think that's a realistic
Did not hear the question.
possibility that Poland might eventually, under some circumstances, consider inserting?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
The question that Charlie raised is whether or not Poland might, under some circumstances, eventually.
I don't know if you can hear me. I apologize. I could not hear the question.
We're going to have to go to Charlie now. So we'll, Charlie, let me turn one of these questions to you here. In particular, this might actually be a good place to wind up our conversation. We haven't talked much about
Chris, Charlie, if you can hear me, I'm sorry, I can't hear the question.
Charlie?
Yeah, you could also try typing in the question for Paula.
Yeah. Charlie, what do you think about the potential impact of the elections? We haven't talked specifically about the elections this weekend and what's really at stake. You and Ambassador Dobriansky both agree that the priority here in U.S. statecraft ought to be Ukraine and the broader geopolitical context. But you both said that obviously the domestic situation in Poland is a source of concern and something that the U.S. should pay attention to. So How do you see the stakes? Can you characterize for us how you see the stakes in Sunday's election?
Well, I do think that in some ways the stakes are a bit lower because of the war in Ukraine and the degree to which that dominates the agenda and defines a very intense level of cooperation between Warsaw and Washington. But I do think that and maybe this is going on behind the scenes. As I said, I don't think it's really something that should get a lot of public airtime. But I do think the United States should make it clear to law and justice, if they do end up continuing in power, what kinds of behavior the U.S. deems to be inconsistent with liberal democratic practices and liberal democratic norms. I also think that the main actor here is the EU, and the EU should be the primary party that sends the message to Ukraine, that holds to Poland, that holds Poland to certain standards, that considers some kinds of sanctions or withholding of funds. And this has all been part of the EU conversation now for several years about both Poland and Hungary. But as I said, I think the war does require us to lower the volume and the attention on this issue. But I do think it would be a big mistake to set it aside. And that's simply because, as I said, I consider the internal threat to Western democracy to be at least as impotent as the external threat. And so this has to be a part of our conversation going forward.
It's going to be hard to have that conversation as long as Poland is playing this critical role that it's playing in the war in Ukraine, and the war continues. Isn't that right?
To some extent, that's right. And I don't think it's inappropriate because, as I said, I think we are still living through a strategic emergency, and in a strategic emergency, you reorder your priorities. But I do think that as we lay out our longer term agenda for transatlantic cooperation and for consolidating the practices and values that undergird the Atlantic community, all of us, including here in the United States, need to keep a very keen eye on these issues.
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I think we can say that for sure, although it doesn't seem like, unfortunately, this war is going to come to an end anytime soon. And that certainly is going to shape our operating environment in Europe, both on the military front as well as on political and to some degree economic fronts when it comes to American statecraft. So I wonder, as we wind this down, Charlie, if you have any final points that you think would be important to make about, just broadly, again, stepping back, about Poland's role in the future of American statecraft?
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States is fortunate to have in Poland such a staunch ally, such a loyal ally, and a country that tends to see things geopolitically in a way that's very much in keeping with the United States. And as I said, I think that's particularly important for the United States when it comes to the trajectory of Europe moving forward, because the UK's gone.
Yeah. In
France, you will continue to have, probably until the end of time, this sort of undercurrent of Gaullism, of strategic autonomy, of don't let the United States boss us around. Germany, despite the Zeitenwende, is going to be having deep, profound discussions about geopolitics and about whether it really wants to get back in the game of fighting wars. Italy, Spain, they're in their own sort of internal debates about these issues. And And in some ways, Poland is the one big country that does kind of see the world like the United States sees the world. And I think it's important to have that partner, and to have that partner inside the EU. And as I said, I would just make sure that in our relationship with Poland, we keep pushing them on this question of liberalism. And over time, I think we will also encourage them to kind of be better allies, not just of us, but within the EU. Because as I said, the stronger the EU is, the better partner it will be of the United States, and the better off the transatlantic relationship will be.
Charlie, thank you so much. This is Chris Chivvis. This is Pivotal States with the American Statecraft program here at the Carnegie Endowment. I've been talking about Poland with Professor Charlie Kupchan of Georgetown University and Ambassador Paula Dobriansky of the Harvard Kennedy School. Hearty thanks to you both. It's been a fascinating conversation. I look forward to continuing it in the future.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for hosting us.